Well, hello everybody. Happy Thursday evening. My name is Maggie Huemann. I am one of the co-founders and advisory council members of Artemis Sportswomen, and I am the store manager for the Orvis company in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So I have a little bit of a background in entomology. My undergraduate minor is in entomology, and then my master's degree is also in entomology. And I did a local project here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem about macroinvertebrates that live in one of our local rivers. So most of what I'll talk about is kind of more geared towards like the Rocky Mountain area. A lot of it is crossover. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't apply to the East Coast as well. There are some great resources I'll let you know about for East Coast bugs, including macroinvertebrates.org, that'll kind of show you, the similarities. Usually it's just like a species difference between the East Coast and the West Coast, even though the Rockies tend to have some bigger, more romantic, so to speak, bugs. But today we're talking about mayflies. And so I wore my shirt. I'm gonna have to show you guys. So the scientific family name, Latin family name of mayflies is Ephemerality, and that actually means short-lived. So mayflies are one of the shortest lived insects in the entire world. They live about 24 hours as an adult, and then they make eggs and die, which I'll talk about a little bit more here in a second. But I love my live fast, die young shirt, and most people don't get it. So I'm going to do some screen sharing with you guys. So also, if you've got any questions or concerns or something's not showing up right, feel free to type that in the group chat as well. So to get started here. All right, so like I said, mayflies are an order Ephemerality, and they have what's known as aquatic incomplete metamorphosis. And just for a little brief overview here, aquatic incomplete metamorphosis involves eggs being laid underwater or near the water, and those eggs hatching out into what's called a nymph. And then that nymph shedding its exoskeleton multiple times over the course of its immature life before it crawls out to the surface of the water and becomes a terrestrial winged adult. So that process can take a couple years, it can take a couple days. It totally depends on what species we're talking about. And stoneflies were what we talked about last week. They have aquatic incomplete metamorphosis as well. And again, with mayflies, you have the same exact type of life cycle. It's just a little bit different as far as how they grew up in their nymph structure. So we talked about stoneflies last week, and one thing I didn't mention was the really easy way to tell adults when you see them out and about of these three big groups of aquatic insects that we talk about in reference to fishing. So we talk about stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies. So the easiest way to differentiate these as adults is stoneflies are going to have flesh wings. So their wings go over each other on their back. Mayflies are going to have sailboat wings. So they're going to be upright, triangular, floating on the water, or resting on a piece of plant material or something. And then caddisflies, which we'll talk about next week, have roof-like wings. So they're shaped more like a tent or an A-frame house. So just really easy, off-the-cuff way to identify these three insects if you see any of them down by the river. Mayflies, I will say, are definitely the most delicate of these insect groups that we work with. You'll see in my samples here in a minute how ghetto some of them are, because they just like disintegrate because their bodies are just so dainty and delicate. But like I said, they are well known for their upright wings as adults. And then in males and females, you can tell them apart really easily because males, you can see their eyes. Females, there's no distinguishable eye, but on males, there's a really large round eye that typically is what we call turbinate, where it kind of pokes out and upward and they touch each other. The other really cool part about mayflies is they're the exception to every rule. So I like to think of this in terms of like our pronghorn that we have out west. Pronghorn antelope are like an exception to every rule. They have horns and they have antlers. Most animals only have one or the other, and they're the only animal that sheds a horn on a yearly basis. So mayflies in my life are more like an antelope because they have not evolved properly and they are totally different than all their other insect counterparts. So mayflies are the only insect in the entire world that molts as an adult. Most of these insects will molt over the course of their life and shed their exoskeleton in order to grow up, so to speak. So we talk about insects being invertebrates, and we are vertebrates. So as we grow, our bones grow with us, right? So as insects grow, their bones do not grow with them because it's their exoskeleton on the outside. And so in order for them to actually grow, they have to burst through that exoskeleton, and then a new one will harden up over time. But once they reach adulthood, they don't go through this molting process anymore. However, mayflies do. When these nymphs emerge as terrestrial adults, which can sometimes happen on plant material on the bank, but a lot of times it happens in the surface film of the water. Like I was saying, they're really delicate, really small insects. So they can swim to the surface and effectively molt their exoskeleton and use their own body to pull themselves up on their old exoskeleton before they pump their wings full of blood and fly away. A lot of people think that they have to sit there and like flap their wings around and dry them out before they can fly off, but it's more akin to like pumping something up. So all those little veins you see in the mayfly wings are filled with what's known as hemolymph, which is insect blood. And they've kind of got to sit there because they've all been like scrunched and folded up. If you can see the little images behind my head here, these are little mayfly nymphs, and you can see their little wing pads. So all those wings are just kind of scrunched up in those wing pads developing. And then once they emerge out, they kind of floof them out and pump them up full of insect blood, and then they can fly off. When that happens, they're in what's known as the dun or the subimago form. And I use both because one's an angler's term and one's a science term, but they're the same thing. So if you hear an angler talking about, oh, I'm going to fish the PMDs or the pale morning duns, or I want to hit a certain dun hatch, that's what they're talking about, is that immature but adult phase that's known as the dun or the subimago. When they emerge in that form, their wings are typically opaque. So if you can see in the image here where I'm holding the mayfly on my finger, those wings are pretty opaque. You can't see all the way through them. They're not fully clear. So a mayfly is a fully mature adult once its wings are clear. So it'll do that molt from the dun form, and it's usually within a couple hours, and then that wing will change to a totally clear window pane. And once they're in that form, it is known as the imago or the spinner form. And that is when these insects are sexually mature. They can mate, lay eggs, and die after that. They are not fully mature, and they cannot mate in that dun phase. So again, mayflies are exceptions to a lot of rules, and they're very, very funky bugs, and they're very, very tiny bugs, but we'll get into a little bit more of that. They also have different numbers of tails. Sometimes nymphs can have 2 to 3 tails, and the adults can have 2 to 3 tails, and they will change from nymph to adult. So that's not always the best indicative feature too, because tails tend to get chopped off or eaten off by predators or fall off, or, different things happen to them. But that is kind of a brief little overview of their life history. And when we talk about mayfly ecology, we'll look at this specifically when we look at some specimens, but they operate in a couple of different movement groups and a couple of different feeding groups. And that's typically one of the best ways to break out mayflies, is by these different ecological things that they do, and it helps you kind of separate them out and be able to tell what they are based on their body shape or what they're doing. So as far as movement goes, mayflies come in 4 different groups of movement. They can either burrow. So if you think about it, something that burrows is maybe more adept to having like a pointy face, a more slenderized body. So burrowers, they have these nifty little tusks on the front of their face, and they use them to kind of shovel out sand and silt in the bottom of their stream beds, and they'll dig out what's known as like little U-shaped burrows, and they'll stay in these U-shaped burrows pretty much their whole immature life before they emerge out. And so when you also think about it in terms of ecology, does that mean that we're going to be fishing with burrowers a lot? Are we going to be fishing burrower nymphs a lot? Probably not, because fish aren't digging holes at the bottom of the river. They're looking for stuff that's more kind of floating in the drift. So clingers are the second major movement group. And if you think about it, it's pretty much what it says it is. They're clinging on. And I like to think of clingers as they cling on for dear life. The next movement group is a crawler, and they kind of have similar flattened body shapes, but clingers do not have the robustness to their body to be able to hold on very good. So they're literally just hanging on for dear life onto rocks and different things under the water. Crawlers typically have a more stout and spiny appearance. Crawlers are what you see behind me. And so, you know, they got kind of these like big crawly spread out legs. They've got a more flattened body, and they can move along rocks and different surfaces and really high water flows. So the ones that are behind me right now are actually green drakes, and those typically hatch out in really highly oxygenated bodies of water, and they are very, very strong and can hang on and don't get blown away by, you know, tailwaters, you know, dams raising water flows and spring runoff and stuff like that is not gonna, you know, send all these guys down river. They can hold on pretty well. And then there's swimmers, and swimmers are exactly what you'd think they would be. They're going to have more of a minnow-shaped body, and they're going to look more like a tiny little bait fish. So they can kind of freely swim in the water column wherever they want to go. They will cling on to things, but you know, if water comes rushing down, they've got the ability to swim back up to wherever they got kicked out of. So those are the four main movement groups. And then we talk about different feeding groups. So when mayflies feed, first thing, they only feed as nymphs. Mayflies do not feed at all as adults. That's one of the funniest things to me too, is that they emerge out, they have this like 24 to 48 hour adult lifespan, and you know, the good Lord didn't see it in his heart to give them functioning mouth parts. They're what's known as vestigial, so they look like a mouth, but they don't actually work, and they never actually feed as adults. So don't have to worry about mayflies and their feeding as adults. But as nymphs, there's a couple different ways they can get food. So they can either filter, and filter feeding is pretty much regaled to one family unit of mayflies that we'll talk about first, the Amletus or brown duns. And if you look at their mouths, they're literally, it looks like a comb. It looks like two big combs right there. And so all this stuff just comes rushing into their mouth, and they use those combs to kind of filter feed and grab things out. Then you have gatherers, and gatherers might be mayflies that are kind of spend a lot of time on some rocks, and they're gathering up different diatoms and algae and things like that, and kind of building out a little bit of a pantry, and maybe are a little bit more territorial. Scrapers, exactly what you think. They're going to scrape algae and things off of rocks. Shredders are going to shred things at the bottom of the river. So any leaf detritus and things that fall in over the course of the year, you know, turning that all into fine particles at the bottom of the river is the job of a lot of these aquatic insects. So shredders are shredding things, and then predators obviously are hunting things and are eating smaller bugs. These guys behind me, I had to take them out of my tank the other day because they were eating some smaller bugs. All right. So just to review identifying features for nymphs and adults, the nymphs have 2 or 3 tails. They have 1 tarsal claw on each segment. And last week when we talked about stoneflies, one of their identifying features is they have 2 tarsal claws on each segment. And then they have gills on their abdomen. That's one of the biggest ways that we identify aquatic insects, is based on their gills, their gill structure, their gill placement. In mayflies, pretty much all of their gills are going to be on their abdomen. So if you see gills moving, you know right away that it's a mayfly on it if they're moving on its abdomen. Like I was saying, stoneflies and caddisflies typically have like armpit gills or anal gills, but if you see anything along that abdominal portion of the insect, it is most likely a mayfly nymph. When we talk about adults, sailboat wings, again, there can or cannot be a hind wing. So sometimes you're going to see mayflies with 4 total wings. Sometimes you're going to see mayflies with 2 total wings. A lot of times that hind wing is seriously reduced and is way smaller. They're never equitable size. So again, in the stoneflies, you had equitable size and your four wings kind of coming out. In mayflies, we are not going to have that. Like I said, when the hind wing is present, it's way, way smaller than the forewing. And then they either have 2 or 3 tails. So again, totally depends on the species that you're talking about. So I'm going to jump right into some different families here. Just a quick review on that too. I don't know if anybody remembers the old King Philip crosses oceans for great, whatever you want it to be. But it's kingdom Amelia, phylum Arthropida. Arthropida actually means jointed foot. So if you look at their little legs and feet, they're jointed. They're in class Insecta, order Ephemeraptera. And then we will start at our first family here, Amelididae. So the Amelidas family is known as brown duns. They're recognized by having mottled wings as adults, and then as nymphs, they're recognized by having kind of a minnow-like mayfly body. And then I'm going to play around here with some sharing. There we go. So this is an Amelidas mayfly. So if you look at its little body right there, it's super streamlined. It's very like torpedo shaped. And he's got kind of a big fat head, but it's very round. It's not flat because we're looking at him from a dorsal or ventral view. And then right here, this is really cool. I got a little exoskeleton. So you can kind of see that last little exoskeleton that he shed before he dedicated his life to science. So I wish you could see up close though, that comb mouth. And I'm gonna see here if I can. So if you can see right here, that Amelidas nymph was what I was telling you about, that filter feeds. And so if you look, this is an up close view of his mouth, and it literally looks like little combs. And he uses that to filter feed. This was that website I was mentioning. That's a really good resource for like if you really want to get in the weeds with identifying bugs. Macroinvertebrates.org is a great place to go, and they have a lot of East Coast resources as well. Streamlined little torpedo body on that amelidid nymph. And then you guys are gonna have to bear with me as I kind of slide around. I got all these bugs in an ice cube tray as I'm trying to figure out. But like I was saying, mayflies are super duper delicate. But you can see on this one how he's got the really upright sailboat wings. And you can see that little bit of modeling that they were talking about right around the tips of his wings. And again, just super, super dainty, tiny, tiny size. If that gives you any inclination here. Like there's a dime in there somewhere. So really, really tiny. So I'm going to move it to our next little group of guys. Next group, really, really big group that we deal with all over the country, and that is family Betidae. And I've actually had college professors that call it Betis. Most anglers call it Betis. So I think it's tomato, tomato, whatever you want to call it. But these include our BWOs, or blue wing olives, and our minnow mayflies, or calabatus. But there's tons and tons of different beta species out there. But if you can see in that picture, it's very similar to that Amelidas being a swimmer mayfly. It's got more of a torpedo shaped to the body, and it can kind of freely swim around, does not have to cling on to any particular substrate. They're small with typically a green and gray body. We don't fish these a lot in their spinner form. So that is another thing to kind of take note as we go along, just based on their ecology, what and how you'd be actually fishing these bugs is really interesting to take into consideration. Because like I was saying, on those brown drakes or the ones that burrow, you're not going to be fishing those in a nymph. Beta spinner falls happen at night. So we do not fish beta spinner falls very often because it's mostly in the pitch black dark. But again, they are swimmers. They scrape or gather their food. They're not predatory. And then we'll have typically more than one generation a year in these, like blue-winged olives or BWOs. Like I said, there will be lots of different things that anglers, hang on, that anglers call them. BWOs and PMDs are two of the most common that people use their abbreviations for. But blue-winged olives are definitely one of our, it's something I've been fishing quite a bit the last couple of weeks. Just with the colder weather, they emerge in a little bit colder temperatures, so we typically see them in the springtime and again in the fall or winter. All right, so that is a little beta nymph there. Like, it's counterintuitive with the camera because you're going the opposite direction, you think. But yeah, so again, little streamlined body. Sorry, that's not a very glamorous specimen. There's a couple more of his little friends. Wrong way, wrong way. So you can really see on that dark one too, the outline of his wing pads. And so if you ever do get in the weeds with all this entomology stuff and you want to learn how to identify nymphs better, you always want to find the darkest colored ones because that means they're at their most mature point. When mayflies are born, they don't always have gills right away. Those develop as they molt over time. And again, they're one of the most indicating features for these different species. So you want to have one that's super dark colored. So when we talk about an adult, again, another really sad specimen here. I don't even think that is, yeah, it's little bitty dark and legs and wings have all fallen off. So we're gonna move along from that one. But just to show you guys too, see if I can get it under there. So like flies that you might use for these, I don't know what the best way to show you these is. Like the fly that you might use, it's like a WD-40 blue-wing olive nymph for the nymph phase. Jujubatus is another really tiny pattern that I like to use for these guys. And then one thing I touched on a little bit earlier, but it really comes into play if you're fishing for these guys a lot, is the emergence. So like I was saying, mayflies are dainty enough that they can kind of pull themselves up from their own nymphal shuck. But typically when you're fishing other aquatic insects, you're fishing the nymph or the adult. In mayflies, we get an opportunity to fish emergers and cripples. And both of those are kind of referring to the same-ish type of thing. Again, this is an example of one here. This is what we would call an emerger pattern. It's kind of got that little floofy stuff coming out the top. So the fly is kind of going to hang below the water surface and the stuff on top is just going to kind of keep it hanging there. But that's going to imitate that mayfly pulling itself out of its shuck. And then if you fish a cripple pattern, that imitates a mayfly that is coming out of a shuck that gets kind of hung up. Maybe one of his legs or something gets stuck in the shuck. And then it makes it more difficult for him to get out. So you're struggling, and then the fish see that as an easy meal. One thing of note too with mayflies is they do emerge in epic abundance. This is not like a staggered emergence throughout the year. This is like they all come at once. So sense of urgency for getting to the river for a hatch is real because there might only be 2 or 3 days that this hatch is going on. And it's a genetic strategy actually on the part of mayflies because they all want to hatch at once in order to hope that their genetics make it on and that some survive, because if they hatched out in a more staggered way, they are so vulnerable to predation that they would just get whacked by fish and predators and birds especially. They're a huge target insect meal of birds. And so they'll all hatch at once just to kind of overwhelm the predators so that they, you know, just have to choose a handful and that we know there's going to be more that survive. So again, emerger and cripple patterns are great to fish with some of these mayflies. This is another one. This is a BWO emerger, but you see that little white foam dot on the top? It's called a brook sprout. But that little white foam dot is great because you can actually see it because blue wings are really small And so they're really difficult to see sometimes. So that's family Betidae. The next one is one of my favorites. This is our burrower mayflies that we were talking about earlier. Really not easy to sample. You basically have to dig all in the bottoms of the banks to find these bugs. So you kind of have to know when they're about to emerge and they're coming closer to the banks to be able to collect them. But the common name of these guys is a brown drake. And they are really easy to recognize because they have super mottled wings. I don't know if you can tell in that middle picture, but there's like 100 of them in that middle picture. And they're all just attached on the blades of grass. And I've walked through that field and I've never seen anything like that, just blankets and blankets of bugs. They are filterers and gatherers. So they kind of use that little pointy face, stick their heads out of their U-shaped burrows and filter and gather the food that passes by. They are univoltine. So univoltine means one generation per year. So if they're bivoltine, they'll have two and so on and so forth. But univoltine means it happens one time a year. So again, that sense of urgency, the hatch is happening, get to the river. This is only happening one time. And these are really big bugs. So they're really fun to fish. So sense of urgency for sure. They're brown and yellowish, and they tend to have like the same carryover colors from nymphs to adults. The adults I've seen even more yellow, like the nymphs that you see in the picture here. Let me see. So if you can see those guys, those are the faces of some brown drakes. So you can kind of see those tusks that I was talking about. You see, I mean, they almost look like a mole or something. But that really helps them to be able to dig out those burrows and protect themselves from predation. So again, definitely one of the easier species to identify just based on like how crazy they look and the fact that they have those tusks at their heads. There you can really see them. And then again, you can also see that dark and black kind of wing pad shooting off the back. So these guys I collected about probably 5 to 6 hours before they all started emerging. So these guys were really getting ready to pop out of their exoskeleton and unfurl those wings into their done phase. So again, mayflies don't do well as preserved materials over time, but these are some jumbled up little brown drake messes of brown drake duns. So again, really, really mottled wings. A lot of mayflies will have a specific or solid wing color. So you know if it's that size, if it's coming out of somewhere with a silty bottom, you're gonna know it's a brown drake for sure. One mayfly that I'm not reviewing in this talk is the Calabatus mayfly. It's another mottled wing mayfly, but you can identify it super easily because it's the only mayfly that lives in lakes. So most of these that we're talking about are moving in or living in stronger river systems, creeks, streams, that sort of thing. But there is one species of lake-dwelling mayfly called the Calabatus. There are other ones in the Midwest and the East Coast, the Hexagenia. There are some that live in deeper water lakes, but for the Rockies in particular, brown drakes are kind of our big burrower. Brown drakes. Then the next one. This is a huge, huge group. So picture behind my head is what we're talking about here. The Ephemerality are a kind of catch-all family. They include our green drakes, which are one of our biggest, most robust, most populous bugs that we see over the course of the summer. And then it also includes PMDs. So like I said, if you're an angler, you've probably heard at some point somebody say PMD. I always joke that that's also like one of the biggest guide cop-outs. If they don't know what something is, they're going to tell you it's PMD. But PMD stands for pale morning dun. So they're in the dun phase. They're not in their spinner form yet. And your key identifying feature for adults is going to be 3 tails. Your key identifying feature for nymphs is going to be, for the green drakes, the guys behind me, you see how they have kind of like strong arms? They look like little Arnold Schwarzenegger bugs, and they've got muscles on their legs. Those are what lets you know for sure that it's a crawler. But PMDs are very, very similar looking to the green drake nymphs that you see behind me. They're just a little bit less robust. They don't kind of have that bicep pop on their legs, and they're a little bit more streamlined. But I would say as far as bugs that I fish and bugs that I see the most of, they pretty much all come from this family. They don't have any gills on their second abdominal segment, and then they have really kind of stoutish bodies again. So I'll show you. So this guy right here, if you compare him to what you just saw behind my head, is PMD. So you see he has kind of squirrelier arms, not so strong, but pretty similar body shape to it. And then I'll roll right into the green drakes. So again, a little bit more bicep on that arm than the last one, but kind of a similar look to their body. And you can really tell that they're not minnow-like. They're not swimmers. They have a more spread out flat body. And then you can kind of start to see on those little abdominal segments there, those gills, little flappy gills. But just to review, that's a PMD. And these guys are green drakes. So kind of tiny head and kind of little crabby arms. And then you can also see on this guy, because he's bigger, is that one tarsal claw. So if you look at his front arms, you'll see just one claw coming off, whereas on the stoneflies, you could see two. So PMD adults, I can figure this out. Really sad. Sorry. Very pinkish though to the body. And so that's one of our really big hatches here in the summertime is pink PMDs. But again, it's a catch-all kind of category. There's a lot of different species within the PMDs. So you'll see lightish yellow, lightish green, lightish pink. But these are another one that are really fun to fish in a lot of different forms. So we'll fish them starting as a nymph. Let's see that. Let's see if I can get that guy in there. So little pink nymph right there with a bead on it. Does the trick. Again, we talked about last week suggestive versus realistic patterns. So I don't know if you can see this. But so you've got more suggestive attractor type patterns here. So they're bigger and fluffier and don't really have all the specific details of that insect. But then you kind of go along and you can see they get more and more realistic. Sorry about the green screen as you go along. It just depends, again, on where you're fishing, what you might use. So if I was fishing in like a really swift body of water, I probably wouldn't worry about being super realistic. I would worry about just getting it in front of the fish's face and having a little bit of flashiness to it. If I was fishing in a spring creek or a still water situation, I would want to go with a more realistic bug. But PMDs are a great example of what you would use an attractor pattern for. So if you don't know this fly, then you should get to know this fly. This is a parachute Adams. So this is your #1 overall catch-all bug for adult mayflies. So if I'm in a busier river system and there's bugs coming off, I basically look at the hook size or look at the bug size and then pick out a hook size that's similar and go with it, because a parachute Adams could be 50 different species of mayflies. It does not have a specificity dialed into it. So just know that that parachute Adams are what I would go to for pretty much any of these bugs in their adult form, unless I was trying to fish a little bit more specific way. But like I said, those emergers and cripples are great ones. Sorry, these are not the best to see, but this is a bifocal emerger, a little pink with some CDC on it. So another way to fish an emerger pattern for a PMD. And then another really fun way we fish for PMDs quite a bit is through what's known as the rusty spinner. So you probably heard of this one too if you've been in many fly shops, but rusty spinners are really, really big patterns for spent PMDs or PMDs that have gone through that final adult molting stage and are now in their imago form. And so because these emergencies do not happen at night, they happen during the day, we get a big opportunity to fish them. So as far as PMDs go, I could fish a nymph, I could fish a cripple, I could fish an emerger, I could fish a dun, and I can fish a spinner. So I'm fishing 5 different life forms in a PMD, which is pretty insane. So they're one that you get to cover all bases with, that there's not one portion of the life cycle that you're missing out on. No, I didn't show y'all a minute ago, but like this is a brown drake. So this is an example of a pattern I might use for a brown drake adult. Again, I like those little white foam deals on the back because then you can see your fly really well. All right. So again, that's one of our biggest categories is the ephemerality, and they tend to cover a lot of different really, really important mayfly families. And they emerge kind of in the bulk of the summer. I didn't really talk about that a ton, but we don't really have like winter mayflies, so to speak. When we talked about stoneflies, we do have some winter stoneflies, and we'll have winter caddisflies that emerge, but there's really not winter mayfly, so to speak. Once the temperatures are about mid 40s, and I'm talking about water temperature, not air temperature, once those temps are about mid 40s is when you start seeing those BWOs, and they emerge at the colder of the temperatures. So the majority of these bugs are happening during your peak of summer. So next big group is family Heterogeneity, and that is your flat-headed mayflies. So again, entomologists aren't super creative with names, so they're pretty obvious what families that they can fall under based on head shape, body shape, that sort of thing. But flat-headed mayflies include your March browns and your pale evening duns, and then some of your different quills. But they'll typically have 2 tails as an adult, 2 or 3 tails as a nymph. And then they kind of have a brownish, like burgundy, mahogany kind of color to them. And if you look at that middle picture that I have there, that guy is actually a March brown. And you can tell because when you flip him over, his gills turn into a suction cup. And there's some misnomers about whether or not that actually helps him cling to rocks, or if that's just the way the cookie crumbled and that they are shaped. But you always know when you find a flat-headed mayfly, and if you flip it over, if it has suction cup gills, that it is known as a March brown. And so, like I said, they're clingers, flat, kind of scrimpy little body. So they're just doing their best to hang on for dear life in the water. And they scrape or gather their food, and we only get 1 generation of these per year. So again, it's always really funny that they're called March browns because they don't really emerge until like April or May here. But they're also one of the earlier mayflies that we'll see throughout the year. So if you can see those little guys right there, see how he has a really kind of flat oval shaped head compared to those green drakes we just looked at had kind of a pea head. But when you hold them up and look at them to the side, you can really tell like how flat their little bodies actually are. And then they have those little leafy gills and 3 tails on these particular nymphs. And then slide right over here to an adult. And a really nondescript adult pattern here. Pretty plain looking. You can see his poor little eyeballs are deflated, but that was a male because you can actually see that he has eyeballs. But this is another one that I would probably just use a parachute Adams for, to be quite honest. So far as nymphs go for these guys. Again, little like pretty generic, like a prince nymph or something would totally do the trick. But when you see, get a piece of white paper here so you can see. Maybe you can't see, but there's little stuff coming off of his abdomen. So the tide fly here, he's got little like tinsel and things coming off the side, and so those imitate the gills. But again, a general prince nymph or a smaller pattern hare's ear would totally work. When we're fishing for these mayflies that are what we would consider a clinger or a crawler, I mean, we're not fishing these as if they were on the rock doing that thing. So when you're fishing these, we're fishing them as if they're in what's known as the drift. So when these insects go to molt, or maybe they are ready to emerge, or maybe they've run out of food where they are and they want to head downstream and try and collect a little bit more food downstream, they will basically just let go of what they're holding on to, and that's what's known as insect drift. I mean, it also helps with genetic dispersal as well, but they'll just let go and then they just free float in the water column until they get to their next destination. And so that's mainly when we are fly fishing what we're imitating. We're not imitating a bug crawling on a rock, we're imitating a bug in the drift. So just keep that in mind too as we go along. So those are flat-headed mayflies. This next group I don't have examples of, and to be honest, they are, if you put them in a hook size, they're like a 20, maybe an 18 on a good day. So they're itty bitty bugs. I have a really cool video I'll have to send to you, Marcia, to maybe put out to the group later too, of an emergence of these. Is one of the first times I've ever just like sat on a riverbank and watched these guys emerge last fall. They typically are one of our more fall bugs. So they emerge in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem around August or September. But these are what's known as the trichos. And they're in family Leptohyphidae, and easy to identify as nymphs because they've got these little darkened gill plates right at the tip of their abdomen that you can see really well in that picture. And I don't collect many of these nymphs, again, because of the size of them. Like half of them go through the same net because they're so tiny. And then the adults are just super hard to collect and to keep not mottled up in a ball. But they have 3 tails always as adults and as nymphs, and they have really small fat bodies. So if you ever see an emergence happening and it's a lot of little fat things, you know it's trichos if it's early in the fall. But they almost look like some type of fly or black fly or a gnat or something. But you know, if you're near a body of water, you can kind of figure out what it is. But those really upright sailboat wings are what gives it away. There's usually only 1 generation per year, but in some places there are 2. They're typically like a black to a blackish brown color. But again, don't have any to show you these guys. The pictures are much better because they are itty bitty. They can also be, there's another group that they call the angler's curse that is related to these guys. And part of the reasoning is because of the size. So those are trichos. And then we move on to family Leptophlebiidae. And Leptophlebiidae are mahogany duns. And so they do kind of have a richish mahogany color to them. I'm gonna shut my dog up. But they have really interesting gills. So like I was saying, we identify a lot of things by their gills. Some have filamentous gills, some have plate-like gills, some have forked gills. And these guys are forked gilled. So they've got branched gills all over, but they're really tiny. I actually found one yesterday, but he is itty bitty. So I don't know if you're going to be able to see the forked gills on his abdomen. But they have a really uniform shaped body too. Like the other mayflies that we looked at kind of have, you know, stronger upper body or streamlined lower body. These guys kind of have a uniform size throughout. And they typically emerge in early summer. Let's see here. let's just see if I can get this itty bitty guy on here. Yay, I can kind of see. Can y'all kind of see those little forked gills? But that is a mahogany dun, ironically enough, found in Mahogany Creek. But it has a very uniform shaped body, 3 tails, and same thing as some of the previous ones that I was talking about. I wouldn't go try and match the hatch, so to speak, on a nymph for this. I would use probably the same one that I showed you for the flat-headed mayflies. It has a little stuff around it because the little stuff around the abdomen kind of imitates those gills. For an adult, super faded. You have to replace these specimens like every 2 years or they just get totally bleached out by the alcohol. So we know for a fact that this is the spinner form, right? Because those wings are totally clear. And those are all actually males because I can pick out an eyeball on all of them. And they have a little bit of markings along their abdomen that you can see. And I don't know how well y'all can see this, but at the tail end on the bottom left-hand side of the image, you can kind of see 2 little pincher things. So when the males turn into the spinner form, into that sexually mature form, they develop 2 extra things, and that's elongated forearms and pinchers or lady claspers in the back. So they use those little claspers to catch the females midair and force them to mate with them. And so it's very easy way to tell male from female apart. If you see them at rest, you'll see that the males have super, super long front legs and that they have those little clasper deals on the back. So that is Leptophlebidae. And then very last one is probably actually my favorite one, is gray drakes. And so gray drakes are really, really big, but they're also in the swimmer group of mayflies. So not super easy to collect because they'll live in deep proportions when they have the ability to swim. So typically when I go out collecting and stuff, I'll use my little seine net and I'll kick rocks down the stream, but I can't do that in a super, super deep place. And these swimmer nymphs can tend to be a little bit elusive. But they are easy to identify as adults because they have a really large hind wing and they're really slate gray in color. They have 2 tails. And then, like I said, as nymphs, they are swimmers and they have these giant plate-like gills. That first one we looked at was an Amletus and the brown dun, and it was a swimmer as well, but it has really small plate-like gills. These guys have really huge plate-like gills. And then they do not have comb mouths. They typically are predators or they gather their food. So they're a little bit meaner than some of the other ones. They are bivoltine here locally. They emerge once in July and once in September. And probably one of the coolest insect experiences I've ever had is I wrote a paper on these guys for graduate school and just happenstance went out on the river on my paddleboard one day and got in the mix of like a massive emergence of these, and they're just like crawling out on my paddleboard and on the reeds and stuff around me. So it was super, super cool to actually like watch the entire life cycle go down. And it's something that, you know, now I've gotten to the point where I take pictures when things like that happen, or I'll take pictures of bugs when I see them outside. And it's not because I'm expecting some high quality bug photo to come out of this. It's because then I have a timestamp on it. And I know I go back through my pictures the next year and I'll figure out when things are going to emerge and where based on that. There's also a really good app called iNaturalist. And iNaturalist will allow you to take those pictures and then you can upload them and you can choose whether or not you want to share where the location was. Because, you know, some people's fishing spots, I get it. But they will get scientists to verify what you saw. And so you can really figure out exactly what you found if you use that. So I've been like trying to do like one local river here, and just every time I take a picture of a bug there, I upload it. And so I've got this nice, like, you know, diary, so to speak, of the insect life on that river. So, like I was saying, I sadly do not have a nymph of the gray drakes. But what I think is even cooler, because it's its exoskeleton. Okay, you can kind of see there, like just gauging the frame of, what you're looking at here compared to some of the other bugs. This is really big, all things considered, but kind of streamlined body. And then you can't fully tell, but you can see his little plate-like gills right there on his abdomen. You can see those little vein forks from his gills. And then moving right along, that is an adult. So again, size-wise, very, very large. Once they emerge as a dun, that wing is super duper slate gray. And then this is a spinner for him. He has just shed that slate gray. So all you can see is the venation now, and everything else is clear or opaque. And for a gray drake, this is just like a little gray beadhead nymph. So again, I don't read into stuff too much about like match the hatch and I've got to have this bug kind of thing. If it's a size 12 and it's gray and similar size body throughout, then pick out some in your box that's a size 12 and gray and similar size throughout. Like a lot of times you'll end up fishing midge patterns or caddis patterns for a mayfly or something, and it does, the fish don't know, so don't overthink it, is what I'm trying to say. For gray drake adults, sometimes I use a size 10 parachute Adams or a size 8, just a huge one. But there are some really good specific gray drake patterns out here. This one's called Verminsky's foam gray drake. I really like it because it's got a foam abdomen, and so it floats really well, doesn't get all sinky on you. And then again, just a really big parachute Adams works wonders. Fishing guide husbands delivering flies mid talk, like, no, show them this one. No, don't show them this one. But this is another pattern of his here with the big parachute. So big, ugly stuff. If the fish are hungry, they'll eat it. I've seen them eat popcorn plenty of times. So if we don't have any questions, that is pretty much what I've got on my end. Like I said, didn't cover near everything, but just try to kind of touch on some ones that live here in the Rockies. And there's over 20 families of mayflies that live in the United States. So I'm definitely sure I didn't hit on everything, but if you need a really good resource, I would check out troutnut.com and macroinvertebrates.org. Those are both really good ones. And then I don't know the exact web page, but I think it's gunnisoninsects.org is also another really good resource if you're looking for insect keys and more specifics about species and stuff, which, we probably all got a lot of time on our hands right now. So if you want to get into learning gill structure of mayflies, what better time than the present? So if anybody's got any questions, just Marsha will turn you off mute and ask away.
Too.
Yep.
And include the resources that were mentioned too. Great
resource here, one of my favorites, Western Mayfly Hatch book. And then there is also a hatch guide to Eastern and Western aquatic insects by Rick Schulmeyer that you could probably find on Amazon or Angler's Book Supply or something like that. So lots of good resources out there.
And next week, caddisflies, right, Maggie?
Yep.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. If you think of questions afterwards, don't hesitate to email us, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Have a good night.